Thank you, Mark, and thank you everybody for giving me an opportunity to grill one of our biggest clients in public. Today we do a lot of work with ISPT, which we enjoy. Many great places have been created by the community or government projects over time when they haven't had the constraints of commercial and investment decisions. No Fed Square, we're standing in one now. From a commercial point of view, it wouldn't have been a viable project, but it's a great place. But placemaking of scale also in a commercial or investment sense or non-government, it requires a number of different elements to align for them to happen. And I just want to touch on a couple of the key elements that need to align in making place in the commercial sector. Equity is clear. You need equity, and you also need a very liquid debt market and funding market. You need money to make it happen. You need the vision for projects such as Mark and ISPT at a project level, but also from a long-term investment point of view. You've got to have a vision for what you're doing. You need favourable market conditions, and usually that's economic driven. You need a manageable planning and governance framework to enable transparency and to limit delays as far as your investment decisions go. But ultimately is driven on investment returns. They drive all the decisions. The developers and investors have to look after their own investors or their own constituents, whether they're superannuants, for example, and they need a market return or a market plus return long term in making those decisions. And most investors have a desire to leave a legacy and to make great places because they're sensible decisions. But effectively, the risk assessment around that is a vital part of that consideration. And it is ideal when government and the investment community can work together to deliver great spaces, both from a community and from an investment point of view. And in that sense, planning is often a very imperative part of that. Many great projects or places over the years have been developed in times of great folly, when you've got excessive debt and blind optimism drive a lot of decisions. And Melbourne's benefited a lot in the commercial sector with buildings like 101 Collins Street or 120 Collins Street or 333 Collins Street came about in times of irrational exuberance, if I could put it that way. And Southgate itself opened up the South Bank, was the beachhead to the South Bank here in Melbourne. Which has gone on from there, but it actually cost Westpac about $500 million, literally, in that project. So we thank them for their contribution. Melbourne Central is another one in that same era in the 80s. In the 70s, Collins Place was developed. Once again, not financially viable, but in exuberant times. And it's been great for Melbourne, and indeed the gold rush in the 1800s left a great legacy. But ultimately, for a place to be developed in the commercial sector, you need groups like ISPT, who take a long-term view of their investment returns and create quality assets. But to quote Mark in our discussions, is not for the faint-hearted. We might ask him a couple of questions about that in a moment. One of the key things in looking ahead in the vision in a project that's planned, you need to create new rental benchmarks, which ISPT are looking at here, and fulfilling the visions have a lot of challenges when it comes to demonstrating the end value of that project. The expected or forecast end value basically drives the decision whether you in fact do this or whether it's worth doing from an investment point of view. But the valuation process is actually assessing current market values and assessment and looking back at previous market evidence, which then therefore becomes quite a barrier to actually making the decision on end value and whether it's a worthy project. That's particularly when significant debt is involved in projects, because banks are very risk averse and they assess risk very, very, very carefully. So I think to that extent, Mark, there's a couple of things I'd like to ask you here. Firstly, the valuing the vision, if I put it that way, from a valuation and end value point of view, what barriers has that sort of created in you looking at a project like Winter Garden? And I will join you over here for some questions.
Look, there's a couple of things that have happened. You're tussling with accounting standards, you're tussling with unit pricing in a fund such as ours, which is done on a quarterly basis by external valuation. It's independent of our own views, and quite frankly, we can't get valuation support for that project. We've proceeded based off our own forecasting, our own modelling, and that's been a brave decision by the board, the investors and the CEO. As well as the staff in the fund. But essentially, sometimes you just can't. You can't prove these things up on today's assumptions and based on what was there if you're creating something unique. That's cost us $30 million in the last quarter in paper losses on the project. That's just the reality of how the market looks at these things with the short term here and now.
The other thing along the same lines, because of the nature of your organisation, you're able to equity fund a project like this. So it's an equity funded project rather than using a traditional funding model which requires significant debt. How important was that in this decision, and could you have undertaken a project like this using the more traditional debt model?
We're a user of debt. We've got some quite astronomical debt facilities in the group. But as a relative proportion to the equity base, the core fund is only geared at about 11%. So really that leaves us free to spend that and invest that money, I should say, not spend, because we don't spend. Invest that money for that super long-term horizon, and perhaps with the right track record and the right scale of group you could debt fund it. I think most groups wouldn't be able to debt fund perhaps a project of this scale, particularly with the GFC, and I think what has been shown out of the GFC, referencing David's exuberance and folly views on some projects, if your project can continue through a shock and a downturn, then it's a good project. And this project's not missed a day in terms of the GFC or those impacts.
Out of interest for the benefit of everybody here, what sort of returns would you have been shooting for in a project like this, internal rate of return on your equity? What sort of parameters?
Look, our investment horizon's a little different. We're a core long-term investor. So our formal benchmark is CPI plus 6 over 10 years. That takes in the inevitable down cycle, as we've had, just like everyone else. Last year was minus 15. A tough year, the first really tough year for the business. So we're always looking at CPI plus 6 as our long-term hurdle. I think when you add a project like this, for us, we're looking at project IRRs 12%, low teens. It's not astronomical, but we do see that that's a minimum hurdle, and the placemaking comes in basically trying to shoot the lights out on that and get a far superior return.
There are a lot of challenges with projects like this. Risk comes in many forms: market risk, construction risk, valuation risk, funding risks, a whole range of risks. It's a challenging business, but ultimately, halfway through this project, what would keep you awake at night most on an $850 million project in the middle of Brisbane?
We probably started with 300 critical issues that we had to solve. The thing that keeps me awake at night is we've still got 100 to go, and we're actually spending $10 million a month, thereabouts, at the moment. You can never de-risk these things on this scale before you start. You have to back yourself in and solve progressively. Time is the big thing. That's the thing that we're always worried about on a large project like this. Time will kill you dead in development if you're not watching it. And really it's been honing in on the key things which could disrupt our program. The rest of it, largely, without sounding blasé, is a matter of money and creativity to solve problems. And the only other one that really kept us awake for a while was some obstruction from those who really didn't see the way forward as we did. And at various times that has included important stakeholders from the community. It's included elements of government, and we've had to convince, cajole and cooperate to get to a vision of place and investment outcomes that met our requirements. So they're the two things.
The other one, if we have time, are we right for time? I touched on planning, and there's been a lot of discussion about planning and design and the future cities, but what planning challenges did you face, and did they sort of limit your ability to create the vision that you had in mind?
Look, I think with a place that's already part of a recognised place, that's a key challenge. So, yeah, the mall in Brisbane is rightly fiercely guarded. There are a whole set of extra constraints that don't apply throughout the Brisbane CBD, and that's as it should be. Otherwise, it would be open slather for anyone to basically wreck that place. So I think when you're doing this type of job in an established place, you need to be very cautious of not just the explicit planning, but the implicit planning that always sits as the subtext, which is personal views, biases, history, the way things have been. And being from Melbourne, we're a very large investor in southeast Queensland, but you've still got to get that understanding and respect for someone else's place. And the planning instruments are slightly blunt in that regard. And so whilst we were always complying with our obligations under that, there's been a whole range of things we've had to do which are well in excess of town planning traditions or the formal instruments.
Okay, I'm getting the wind up. But I was going to ask you in hindsight, would you do anything differently? But I'll let you off there. But on that note, thank you very much.